The first time I walked into a serious boardroom negotiation, not a shul, not a lecture hall, a real negotiation with real capital on the table. I was 31 years old, and I had two things no one else in that room had. I had the Talmud in my head, and I had patience measured in generations. The man across from me was a sharp operator. He had a Harvard MBA, a Bloomberg terminal, and 30 years of deal flow. He was playing chess. I was playing a game that started 3,000 years before chess was invented. I won that negotiation, not because I was smarter, but because I was operating from a different set of rules. Those rules are not secret. They are written down. They have been written down for centuries. What the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the Warburgs understood, and what most people never bother to read, is that durable wealth is not an accident. It is a discipline. And today I am going to give you 5 specific behaviors, documented, attributed, and grounded in our texts, that separate the dynasties from everyone else. Stay with me through behavior 5. That is the one that almost never gets discussed, and the one that, in my experience running businesses, makes the single biggest difference. Before I give you the 5, I want to be precise about what this video is and what it is not. I am not here to tell you that a handful of families secretly control the world. I have no patience for that nonsense, and frankly, it is an insult to the actual work these families did. What I am telling you is documented business history, attached to real names, real dates, and real numbers, and underneath that history sits a body of law that I read every single day. When I attribute something, I will tell you the source. When I do not know something for certain, I will say so. That is the standard I hold myself to, and it is the standard our tradition demands. A teaching without a name attached to it is just a rumor. So everything I give you tonight has a name on it. Let me start with a fact most people do not know. In 1907, the United States had no central bank. The country was lurching through a financial panic, banks failing, depositors lining up in the streets, credit markets seizing like a broken engine. Into that chaos stepped Jacob Schiff, J.P. Morgan, and a German Jewish banker named Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg had grown up inside the MM. Warburg Banking House in Hamburg, one of the oldest private banking firms in Europe, founded in 1798 and still operating today, which already tells you something. Paul came to America in 1902, married into the Loeb family of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and spent the next decade quietly advocating for monetary reform. Historian Ron Chernow, in his biography of the House of Morgan, documents how Warburg's proposals drew directly on the European central banking model, a model rooted in long-term monetary stability, not short-term speculation. In 1913, after years of lobbying and the famous Jekyll Island meetings, the Federal Reserve was established. Paul Warburg became one of its first governors. This is documented history. It is in congressional records, in Chernow's work, in Niall Ferguson's history of the Rothschild family, which traces the same pattern across 2 centuries. These families did not just participate in financial systems, they helped architect them. Notice what I am not saying. I am not saying Warburg controlled the Fed or that the Fed was a Jewish plot. That is a lie that has been used to hurt my people for 100 years. What I am saying is far more interesting and entirely true. Warburg was qualified to help design America's central bank because he had inherited 2 centuries of monetary expertise. That expertise is the first behavior I want to walk you through. Behavior 1. They invest in information and relationships before they invest in assets. The Talmud in Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, verse 14, records Hillel's teaching. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Generations of rabbis have read this as a statement about personal responsibility and community obligations simultaneously. As a businessman, I read it as a capital allocation principle. You cannot hoard information. You cannot build a dynasty by knowing things and telling no one. The Warburg and Rothschild networks functioned precisely because information traveled inside the family and inside a trusted circle faster than it traveled anywhere else. Niall Ferguson's 2-volume History of the Rothschilds, published in 1998, documents how Nathan Rothschild in London was receiving price information from Paris and Frankfurt via private courier days before it reached the general market in the early 19th century. Was that illegal? By the standards of the time, no. There were no information disclosure laws. Was it strategic? Absolutely. And where did that instinct come from? From a culture that has spent 3,000 years treating the transmission of knowledge as a sacred obligation. We have a word for it. Torah lishma, learning for its own sake. But in practice, in the real world of commerce, learning for its own sake builds the relational capital that eventually becomes financial capital. I have seen this in my own businesses. The deals that changed my trajectory did not come from a pitch deck. They came from people who trusted me because I had been in conversation with them, real conversation, not networking theater, for years before any transaction was on the table. Let me give you the practical version. Most people network when they need something. They show up at the event, collect cards, ask for the deal, and disappear. The dynasties did the opposite. They built the relationship years before there was anything to ask for, and they made themselves useful with no expectation of return. By the time the opportunity arrived, the trust was already paid for. Behavior 1 is this: before you chase an asset, build the room of people who know what you know and trust you with what they know. That is the Warburg model. That is the Hillel model. And here is the test. If you only call someone when you want something, you have not built a relationship. You have built a transaction. Dynasties are built on the first one, not the second. Behavior 2. They separate operating money from dynasty money. Paul Warburg's son, James Paul Warburg, writing in his memoir The Long Road Home in 1964, described how the family treated certain pools of capital as categorically untouchable by operational needs. This was not a new idea. It is, in fact, a direct application of the concept of ma'aza, the tithe. In Jewish law, you set aside 1/10 of your income as sacred, as designated for a purpose beyond your daily needs. The Talmud in Bava Metzia, folio 42a, gives us the rule directly. A man should always divide his money into 3 parts: 1/3 in land, 1/3 in commerce, and 1/3 kept ready in his hand. The rabbis were not giving you a stock tip. They were encoding a principle that predates modern portfolio theory by 1,500 years. Diversification and compartmentalization are protective, not just profitable. Never let one category of asset hold all of your survival. John D. Rockefeller took this further in a direction that historians like Ron Chernow document extensively in Titan, published in 1998. Rockefeller kept meticulous ledgers from the age of 16. He called that little book his Ledger A, and Chernow records that he treasured it his entire life. He tithed from his very first paycheck, not symbolically, not because someone told him to, but because, as Chernow records, he believed the money was never entirely his. It was held in stewardship. From that discipline came the habit of separating what was for living from what was for building. When Standard Oil became the most valuable corporation in American history by the early 20th century, the underlying habit was the same 16-year-old's ledger multiplied by 40 years of compounding. Here is the practical application. Most people who earn more spend more. Every raise becomes a new lifestyle. Every windfall disappears into consumption. Dynasty builders do not do this. They have a structure, formal or informal, that puts a wall between the money they live on and the money that is building the next generation's foundation. Build that wall, even if it is small, even if it is 10% of what you earn. The Talmud did not say wait until you are rich to tithe. It said tithe first. From the beginning, when 10% is a small number and the habit is the entire point. Let me pause here and ask you something, because this is the question I get most often from people who come to me for mentorship. They say, "Rabbi, I understand the principle, but these families had advantages I do not have. They had connections, they had capital, they started from a different place." And I want to be honest with you. Yes, they did. The Rothschilds started with Mayamschel's Frankfurt counting house in the 1760s. The Warburgs had 2 centuries of institutional knowledge in Hamburg. I am not telling you that you can replicate their starting conditions. I am telling you that the behaviors I am describing, the disciplines, the frameworks, those are available to everyone. They are in the books we have had for 3,000 years. The question is whether you are going to read them as history or as instructions. The Rothschilds did not invent the principles. They inherited them the same way you can. The advantage was never the gold in the vault. The advantage was the operating system in the head. Behavior 3, they used debt as a tool, not a crutch. Mishlei, Proverbs, chapter 22, verse 7, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender." This is not an anti-debt verse. Read it carefully. It is a power map. It tells you exactly where you do not want to be, and by implication, exactly where you do want to be. The Rothschilds made their initial fortune not by avoiding sovereign debt, but by becoming the lenders to sovereigns. Niall Ferguson documents in The World's Banker how Nathan Rothschild financed the Duke of Wellington's campaigns against Napoleon through a complex web of bill transactions, managing currency risk across 5 countries simultaneously. The family was not afraid of debt instruments. They were afraid of being on the wrong side of them. This is a critical distinction, and the texts go deeper than just the warning. The Talmud in Bava Metzia, folio 60a, discusses the ethics of commerce in remarkable detail. It addresses honest pricing, transparent terms, and the prohibition against Genevat Dart, the deception of another person's mind in a transaction. The rabbis there are wrestling with how far a seller may go in making his goods attractive before it crosses into fraud. They were not naive about the power dynamics of lending and dealing. They were building a framework for using financial instruments with integrity rather than exploitation. There is one more verse I want you to hold on to. Mishlei, chapter 13, verse 11. "Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but he who gathers little by little will increase it." Read that next to the verse about the borrower. Together they form the entire Torah philosophy of leverage. Debt that lets you gather little by little, that builds an asset slowly and steadily, is permitted, even wise. Debt that promises wealth hastily, that funds a shortcut, that bets on a windfall, that dwindles every time. In my own business career, I have taken on debt 3 times. Each time I ask myself one question before I signed anything. Am I borrowing to build an asset that will outlive this loan, or am I borrowing to survive this month? The first is Torah. The second is the beginning of slavery. Know the difference. Use leverage to acquire assets that produce income. Never use leverage to fund lifestyle. The dynasties understood this. They passed it down. Most of the people who burned out in the 2008 financial crisis were on the wrong side of Mishlei 2:7, not because they were bad people, but because no one had taught them which side to be on. Now, before I give you the 4th behavior, let me say something, because I know how these videos go. You are nodding along, you agree, and tomorrow none of this will have changed your life. So I am going to make behavior 5 impossible to ignore. Behavior 5 is the one that, when I finally understood it in my own 40s, changed more about my net worth than the other 4 combined. Most people will never hear it explained the way I am about to explain it. So hold on. We are almost there. Behavior 4. They educate the family, not just the heirs. Here is the story I want to tell you from Bereshit, Genesis, chapter 41. You know Joseph. Most people know Joseph as the dreamer, the one with the coat, the one sold into slavery by his brothers. But look at what Joseph actually does when he comes to power in Egypt. Pharaoh has a dream: 7 fat cows, 7 thin cows, 7 full ears of grain, 7 withered. None of Pharaoh's wise men can interpret it. Joseph is brought from prison. He interprets the dream: 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. And then he does something that goes beyond the dream. He tells Pharaoh, "Appoint a discerning and wise man over Egypt, and let him collect 1/5 of the harvest during the 7 good years, and store it, and it will be a reserve for the 7 bad years." Joseph is not just forecasting. He is designing an institutional response to a cyclical threat. He is building a system that will outlive any single individual's tenure, including his own. That is behavior 4. The dynasty thinkers build systems and institutions, not just portfolios. They invest in educating the entire family, not just the one brilliant heir. Nathan Rothschild's sons all ran separate houses: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples. They were not competitors. They were a federated intelligence network. Historian Ferguson describes how they maintained a common cipher, a common set of principles, and a common commitment to family council before any major decision. The Warburg family endowed the Warburg Institute in London, still one of the world's leading centers of cultural history research. Why would a banking family fund an academic institute? Because they understood that intellectual capital and financial capital compound together. And this is where most family fortunes die. The first generation builds it. The second generation maintains it. The third generation, never having been taught the principles, spends it. There is reason the saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, exists in almost every culture. The dynasties beat that curse, not by spoiling their children, but by educating them, by sitting them at the table young and making them carry the principles before they ever touch the money. Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, verse 1, asks the question directly: who is wise? One who learns from every person, not one who hoards wisdom, one who extracts it from everywhere and everyone, and then transmits it to everyone who comes after. Build the educational infrastructure of your family before you build the investment portfolio. A child who understands compounding at 15 is worth more to a dynasty than a vault that the same child will not know how to keep. Behavior 5. They refuse to sell what compounds. This is the one nobody talks about. I have sat in rooms with very successful people, people who have made significant money, and watched them sell assets at precisely the moment those assets were beginning to compound most powerfully. Why? Because the short-term number looks good, because someone made an offer, because they could not hold the discomfort of watching a number on paper versus cash in hand. The dynasties learned something about compounding that most people intellectually acknowledge, but emotionally cannot execute. The Rothschild banking house, at its peak in the mid-19th century, was, according to Niall Ferguson's research, the largest financial institution in the world, with combined capital that dwarfed its rivals and assets exceeding the resources of most European nation-states. That did not happen through spectacular single transactions. It happened through a 200-year refusal to liquidate the core. Mayor Amschel Rothschild reportedly told his sons before he died in 1812, "Stay together, stay united, consult together." The instruction was not about affection. It was about capital concentration. When you split, you dilute. When you hold and compound, you grow in ways that individual decisions can never replicate. Remember Mishlei 13:11. He who gathers little by little will increase it. The verse does not say he who sells at the top will increase it. It says he who gathers and keeps gathering and does not interrupt the gathering. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, verse 14 again. Hillel's third question, if not now, when, has a business interpretation that is the opposite of impatience. It means, if the compounding is happening now, and you interrupt it, you cannot go back. The time to plant is always now. The time to sell is only when the compounding is finished. And for the dynasties, that moment never came, because they structured their holdings so the compounding never had to stop. I will tell you this plainly. The single most expensive financial decision most people make is not a bad investment. It is selling a good one too early. I have done it myself, and it cost me more than any loss ever did. The refusal to sell what compounds is not a passive strategy. It requires active conviction, family governance, institutional structure, and the kind of long-term thinking that comes from a culture that has been planning across generations since Abraham left Ur. Let me bring this home. 5 behaviors, each one documented, each one rooted in texts that have been in your hands or your family's hands for centuries. First, invest in information and relationships before assets. Build the room before you need it. Second, separate dynasty money from operating money. Set aside the 10th. Compartmentalize the thirds, as Bava Metzia teaches. Let the sacred pool compound untouched. Third, use debt as a tool, not a crutch. Know which side of Mishlei 22:7 you are on before you sign anything. Borrow to gather little by little, never to grow rich in a hurry. Fourth, educate the entire family, not just the heirs. Build systems that outlive you. Joseph did not just interpret the dream, he designed the institution. Be Joseph. Fifth, refuse to sell what compounds. This requires governance, conviction, and the generational patience that our tradition has been encoding for 3,000 years. Here is what I want you to do this week. Not next month, not someday, this week. Take one piece of paper. Write down every capital asset you own. Business equity, real estate, investment accounts, anything. Next to each one, write one word. Compound or consume. Compound means it grows and produces. Consume means it costs you. Then ask yourself, what am I selling that should be held? What am I holding that should be sold? That one exercise, 15 minutes, one piece of paper, is the beginning of dynasty thinking. Do it. And then do one more thing. Pick the single relationship that could matter most to your next decade and reach out to that person this week with no ask attached. Just be useful. That is behavior 1 and behavior 5 working together, and it costs you nothing but the discipline to begin. If this channel has given you one insight you can apply, hit subscribe. Next week I am going to walk you through something even more specific, how the Jewish concept of Hegdesh, designated funds, translates directly into a modern trust structure that protects family wealth across 3 generations. I am going to show you the exact mechanism, with the texts and the modern legal parallel side by side. You do not want to miss that one. 3,000 years of business law. They never lost a dynasty by accident. They followed the rules. Now you know one more.